Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the introduction. My name is Andreas Falk, working for SMA since 29 years and now as a system architect for large renewable power plants. I would like to talk about ancillary services for renewable energy sources. Focus is PV. I will talk about voltage support, frequency support, dynamic voltage support, and I will give a summary. And I would like to start with a characterization of ancillary services. You can characterize services with local influence, with global influence. You may have autonomous functions and coordinated functions. First, I would like to talk about autonomous functions. Autonomous means the device itself reacts on the grid situation without any coordination. And the first thing I would like to speak about is the voltage support. The voltage support is injecting of reactive power mainly, and it's from local influence. It influences the grid near the site. And then we have the dynamic voltage support that is activated in case of failures. And that has mainly a local impact, but in case you have voltage dips on the transmission grid, a lot of units injecting reactive power may influence the transmission grid too. And at last, you have the frequency support via power reduction. And that is from global influence, because the frequency is a global parameter in the grid. That three are the established ancillary services, and in red now you have the future services. And at first, the autonomous functions for future services is the spinning reserve. Spinning reserve is reacting on the frequency gradient mainly, not the frequency itself. And the primary reserve is also an autonomous function reacting on the frequency, on frequency dips. And then you have the coordinated functions, so the secondary reserve, reactive power management. That means that the reactive power of many single units is coordinated. For example, many single units in the distribution net influences the reactive power flow in the transmission grid, and that has to be coordinated. That is a future function necessary. And of course, black start with renewables. I would like to talk about voltage support. The transmission grid needs reactive power to operate. And in the situation shown in the figure, you see a light load in the transmission grid. And under that circumstances, the transition grid may behave like a capacitor. Mainly the cabling in the distribution net behave like capacitor. And the distribution net is absorbing reactive power from the transmission grid. And the other way around, when you have heavy load and heavy generation of decentralized sources, then the distribution grid behaves like an inductivity and absorbs reactive power from the grid. Especially when you have heavy generation, many renewable sources have to reduce the voltage in the distribution net to keep the voltage in the band. and that increases the need for reactive power from the transmission grid. So what we have seen is the power stations has to cover the reactive power in the moment, and the direction of reactive power may change for different situations. Challenges for the future is, of course, when we have a very high penetration of renewables, the power stations are not longer there, and then the reactive power has to cover it from the renewable generators, and that has to be performed in a coordinated manner. Next, I would like to talk about the capability, the reactive power capability of a plant, of a power plant. Normally, the utility defines a reactive power capability. This may imply the need to oversize the inverter themselves or the number of inverters. And every operation point has to consider, because we have not a two-dimensional problem but a three-dimensional problem. The reactive power capability depends on the one hand on the active power, on the other hand on the present voltage. So when you see here the white area, the three-dimensional white area, that is all these points in this three-dimensional area has to be reached. Why? Considering the voltage and, of course, the design of the park. The inverter voltage depends on reactive power. Here you have three diagrams. For each diagram, the voltage at point of interconnect is equal, but the inverter voltage differs to different power factors at point of interconnection. First, unity power factor. Then the inverter voltage per unit, of course, per unit is higher the grid voltage. In case we have lagging current at point of interconnect, the inverter voltage is smaller the grid voltage. And at last, in case we have leading current at point of interconnect, then the inverter voltage has to be higher. And for all this, because the utility requires a special amount of reactive power normally, all these operation points has to consider, and an expertise is necessary to calculate the feasibility of all operation points. Here, for example, you see the result of the expertise. In green dotted green or red, you see the capacity the utility is requiring, and in blue you see the operation points achievable. And every point on the blue line is calculated for all voltages within the voltage range. And when you have the expertise, you see whether the red and dotted green areas are within the blue field. Then it's all okay. If not, you have to increase your inverters or you have to add additional inverters. Now I would like to talk about frequency support, and especially about new frequency support, the so-called active power reserve. Active power reserve means that in case we have a frequency dip, additional power has to be injected into the grid. That you can do with two manners. One is to install storages, and then you have a very high availability in a single plant. The PV harvest is not reduced. It operates during all irradiation conditions, especially also during the night. And other grid management functions are feasible in parallel. And the second possibility is to curtail your renewable power plant. Then the availability for the single power plant is much more poor. Especially normally when you have bright sky, it's all is okay, but when the command for or when the frequency dip occur during a moment a cloud is moving towards the array, then you are not able to activate your active power reserve. And of course, due to curtailment, your PV harvest is reduced due to the during curtailment. And what it's important to say that the active power reserve for renewable parks are only activatable in case the power is above a certain limit. When the power falls below 20%, for example, it is not longer possible to generate active power reserve because the tolerances are too high. But the curtailment could be a very fine alternative in case you bundle a lot of single units, because then you have a statistical balancing effect between the units, and the availability of the single unit is not longer that important. How to run a plant with active power reserve? Here you have the units, so an inverter with medium voltage transformer, switchgear in a container in that case, and they are controlled via a power plant controller that controls the energy flow and the reactive energy flow at point of interconnect. And when you have installed, for example, irradiation sensors in the park, you can calculate the available power. You run an algorithm, and the power plant controller gives a set point to the inverters, and the inverters are running below the possible power to be able to inject active power in case of a frequency dip. I would point it out that the probabilistic forecast for a single plant differs a lot with the curtailment. Here in dotted lines, you see for a bright day available power. When you would like to have availability of 95%, for a special amount of active power reserve, you have to reduce regarding the blue line. With yellow line, you reach 99%, and with black line, 99.94%. And when you see in the next figure, you see the active power shaded in dotted lines, and in the gray area, the active power reserve is provided. And you see that you lose a lot of power during this provision for a relative small amount, here white, black, of active power reserve that you can provide. So from an economic point of view, normally active power reserve for renewable sources is only reasonable in case of bundling, not for a single plant. I would like to talk about ramp rate control with batteries. Ramp rate control with batteries you see here. You see in blue the power output of a plant, and in red you see the smoothing with the battery, and in green you see the battery current or battery power. And the ramp rate control the ramp rate control in that case, the ramp rate is limited to 1% of nominal power per minute. And that makes sense mainly in small grids, isolated grids, where you would like to have time to start other resources like diesel engines or others to cover the load in case the PV goes down, or stops the diesel engine in case PV goes up. So that ramp rate control normally makes sense not in big grids, but in small grids. I wanted to have talk about other things too, but a small image about dynamic voltage control. Dynamic voltage control means that reactive power may be injected in case of voltage dips, and in case the voltage is too high. And what you see here in blue and red are the capability of solar inverter to provide dynamic voltage control. In blue you have the provision zone for high voltage right through, and in red the provision zone for low voltage right through. And that zones are that large that normally all the requirements from different standards are fulfilled. Okay, here you see a voltage dip and reaction of the current. Okay, my summary. Large power plants can deliver all ancillary services to operate the grid: voltage support with reactive power, frequency support with active power reduction, frequency support with active power reserve and surplus power during frequency dips, dynamic voltage support. Future services with requiring a coordination are spinning reserve black start capability. Both features can be achieved with batteries more favorable. Okay, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to have some questions.
Thank you, Andreas. We have time for 2 questions.
Hi, I'm Ashish from ICF. Looking at all these supports which photovoltaic can provide, I just wanted to ask you, if we have 1 megawatt of coal plant versus X amount of solar plant, what would be that X amount of solar plant which 1 megawatt of coal plant can provide all these supports to the full extent?
The traditional support like voltage support, frequency reduction and dynamic voltage support, the PV power plant can provide in the same manner like the coal power plant too. Because the injectable reactive power, in case you reduce, of course, the active power to 0 is nominal apparent power. And the inverter can be operated between injecting only reactive power or only active power. It has the ability to operate. But that is normally not requested. So for the traditional ancillary services, there is no difference. There is a difference regarding spinning reserve. A spinning reserve is provided from synchronous generators only in the moment, but the ability of the renewables will become better and better, and in the future, when you have more and more voltage controlled units and not only current controlled unit in the grid, also the spinning reserve can be provided from renewables, and that is visible in only, let's say, 2 to 5 years, not more.
Okay, thank you.
One more question here in the front.
You said the reserves cannot be provided by solar or wind, but if you operate them continuously about 10% below the power by, I mean, from solar, if you, I think you can control the generation by controlling the firing angle or something.
Yes, yes, yes.
So if you continuously operate it below that, then you always have that reserve with you, isn't that? So
Yeah, I said, but of course, for a single plant, you have some uncertainty, because in the moment, for example, when a frequency dip occur, in the moment a cloud occur, then it's pity.
yeah,
It's a pity. But when you have a lot of plants operating in such a manner, of course, you're right, then the renewables can provide active power reserve. And they can provide it especially during curtailment periods when all the other power plants are ramped down. And that is perhaps very important in the future, to in case you have 100% renewables in the grid during certain periods, that are normally the periods where the rest of the renewables are curtailed, and then you have a so-called natural reserve in the background.
I guess if you have 100% renewables, you won't have any choice. You'll have to use those only, along with batteries.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Falk. Thanks very much for your nice presentation.